Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar on the green steel opportunity. I'm Hannah Bretherton, the Lao China Institute's Impact and Engagement Manager, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this session as part of our inaugural China Week. China Week is a new flagship series from the Lao China Institute at King's. And it's a week-long series of events, which will be running through to the end of this week. So please have a look at our program online if you haven't already, and check out what we have going on throughout the week. Today, we are very excited to be holding this webinar in partnership with the China in the World Centre at the Australian National University. For the past few months, we've been working with ANU on a digital project as part of King's COP26 digital engagement. And today we will be premiering this research for the first time. Following the screening, we will hear from industry representative John Johnson, CEO of CEI Group China, who will share industry insights on the broader shifts in the steel sector, and mining and metals industry on the shift to decarbonisation. We will then be welcoming our ANU researchers, including Professor Frank Yotso, Director of the Centre for Climate and Energy Policy at ANU, Dr. Muzami Prasad from the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU, and Associate Professor John Pai from the College of Engineering and Computer Science. We will join together in a panel discussion to pull out the themes from the digital project that you are about to see. And there will be time for audience Q&A as well. So make sure you have your questions ready to put in the chat box or the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. I'm now very pleased to premiere our digital project, the Green Steel Opportunity. Thank you.
Hannah, if I can interrupt, we can't hear any audio.
Thanks, John. We'll just get onto that now. In the last couple of years, there's no denying that the Australia-China relationship has probably hit an all-time low. Despite this, iron ore trade remains significant economically speaking for both countries. And in fact, in 2020 to 2021, Australia's iron ore exports to China actually increased. Aside from their economic significance, this is an important issue to look at when we're talking about sustainability. In the context of COP26 in Glasgow, where it's an opportunity to really discuss which sectors we can look at to decarbonise, and steel production is one of those for Australia and China.
Steel making is a highly energy intensive and emission intensive industry. It consumes around 8.5% of global energy consumption. Just to put in context with other industries, this is the same level as the entire road passenger transport emissions. And this is more than 4 times as much emissions as from the aviation sector. Primary steel making or the virgin steel making route involves iron ore and coking coal. This is the most energy intensive and emission intensive process. 90% of carbon dioxide emissions happens in this process. China is the largest steel producer in the world. 91% of the steel produced is used within the country itself. So the steel that China produces has a lot of value for the economy.
Australia and China mutually depend on each other for the iron ore production and trade relationship. The vast majority, over 80% of Australian iron ore goes to China, and Australia is really the single largest source for iron ore used in China. Of course, China over time could substitute to other sources of iron ore imported from elsewhere, but there's really not much reason to do so because you want to stick with an established supply relationship and you want to go to the lowest cost producers, of course. And so we would expect, no matter what happens, for Australian iron ore to continue to be the mainstay of steel that is produced either in China or for China.
China has set a target of reaching net zero by 2060 and peak emissions by 2030, which means that steel emissions have to be addressed.
If we want to think about how to make steel in a green way without carbon dioxide emissions, then the most likely pathway is going to be using hydrogen as a fuel instead. So when we shift from coal to a fuel that has no carbon in it, the gases that come out of the furnace, instead of being CO2, are just water vapor and the other components of the air. So there's no carbon involved in the process. And this requires changing the way the furnace is set up. In this case, hydrogen would be generated from electrolysis, which would be powered by renewable electricity like solar panels or wind. The work that needs to be done to make all this happen is obviously huge expansion in our renewable energy, but also a lot of work to figure out how to build these new furnaces that use hydrogen instead of coal. If we were to produce green steel in Australia from that iron ore, that iron ore that we currently export, if we were to do that by making hydrogen from electrolyzers, then we would need a lot of electricity. In fact, we would need something like 7 times the current Australian production of electricity in the national electricity market.
The answer to that will lie in locating that industry where we've got the cheapest sources of clean energy and where we can minimize transport cost for iron ore. That would put countries like Australia in the absolute vanguard of a global green steel industry.
We're trying to figure out whether we can do this kind of green steel thing at a really large scale. It's immediately intriguing, the fact that we have most of our iron ore, more than 90% of it, coming from the Pilbara region in northwest Australia, which happens to be one of the best places in the world for solar energy. So there's this really cheap renewable energy opportunity there. If we put out a lot of solar panels there, we can make electricity maybe 30% cheaper than somewhere like Eastern China or Western Europe or something, right? It's a significant cost advantage. So could we maybe use the renewable energy in the Pilbara together with the ore that's also already in the Pilbara? And could we do, could it be that it's cheaper to do the initial stage of iron making there in that part of the world?
Australia and China have a traditionally very important economic and trade relationship. That relationship has been under strain for political reasons in recent years. Getting green steel right, getting the decarbonisation of the global steel industry underway will inevitably include both China as the world's largest steel producer, and it will inevitably include Australia as the world's largest iron ore producer and a substantial producer of coking coal as well, and as one of the countries that can produce renewable zero carbon energy at very, very large scale for export industries. And so collaboration would be an obvious advantage to get that right for the two countries, but also to get it right for the world.
Working together to produce green steel would be an opportunity not just environmentally but for Australia and China politically to work together. That's definitely not an easy feat given the political quagmire that the two countries have been in currently and in recent years, but it's certainly an opportunity that both must take. Despite these and to work together for a more sustainable and prosperous economic future.
I'd now like to welcome John Johnson from CEI Group China. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Hannah, and hello, everybody. Thanks to the Lao China Institute, King's College and ANU for the opportunity here. I represent CRU. We're a London headquartered mining and metals analysis and consulting company. We have a strong presence in sustainability and carbon issues related to mining and metals, particularly in China, where I'm country manager and have been based for the last 17 years. So in the interests of time, I'm going to show you three very simple charts, which hopefully reinforce what you've just seen in the video. So if we could go to the third chart, please, showing the three pies, please, Hannah. Next one, please. Great. So no, backward. So the pie chart, if you could go back a chart, great. This illustrates the importance of China's steel industry to decarbonisation. And I should first give you a simple stat. On average, for every tonne of steel produced, just less than 2 tonnes of CO2 is produced. So to put that into context, for every car, the equivalent of every car produced, almost the equivalent of 2 tonnes weight equivalent of CO2 are produced, which impact on climate change. More than 1.8 billion tonnes of steel are produced globally each year, and China produces more than 1 billion tonnes, or more than 50% of global steel. So it accounts, we estimate, for around 15% of direct CO2 emissions in China, and even more if you add Scope 3 emissions and indirect emissions downstream. So as a result, Chinese steel accounts for approximately 4% of global emissions. That's around 2 billion tonnes of CO2 of a global emission of around 45 billion tonnes, give or take. If we could go to the next chart, please, Hannah. Thank you. And it's a big challenge in China to overcome this, to decarbonise. And it's not only about the sheer volume of Chinese steel production, it's also about the type of steel production. This is a major challenge for China, but it's clear that China is very serious about its decarbonisation plans, notably since President Xi made the announcement last September of zero carbon by 2060. And also, of course, China is still growing economically. In steel, unlike the USA and Europe, steel production in China is more CO2 intensive, since it predominantly uses the traditional blast furnace route, smelting iron ore and coal, and uses much less recycled scrap in the electric arc furnace, which has a smaller carbon footprint. This is partly due to the relative scarcity of scrap in China and the presence of larger quantities of coal. And I think, given the Australian theme here, it's worth saying that China also has some iron ore, but nowhere near enough to satisfy its own requirements. So it imports around 80% of its requirements, notably from Australia. So you can see how that's a big challenge to overcome for China. If we could go to the next, my final chart, please. Potentially the most interesting here. This shows you Scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions for almost every steel mill in the world using CRU's emission analysis tool, from the lowest carbon emitter on the left to the largest emitter on the right. Every bar is CO2 emitted from a steel mill, of which China accounts for a large part of these, of course. As I said earlier, the average is just shy of 2 tonnes of carbon per steel mill. But note the big range from the low to the high levels, and the lowest of the CO2 produced is from recycling scrap on the left, which is electric arc furnace production. And that accounts for about 1/4 of world production. And the more traditional blast furnace route is on the right, accounting for a much larger proportion of the total. So there are ways to reduce carbon in the blast furnace. So if you could press the button once, Hannah, you can see we can reduce the carbon by around 30% by using current best practice, and that may involve optimizing raw materials or optimizing the fuel mix. You can go further. If you could press again, Hannah, please. You can also reduce carbon by up to 40% by using more natural gas to produce what we call direct reduced iron. And then press it again, Hannah, please. The third, by far the biggest, is actually using scrap and changing technology from the blast furnace to scrap-based electric arc furnace. You can reduce carbon emissions by up to 80%. And the final one, Hannah, final press. And if that's renewable energy, almost up to 100% carbon reductions. So that all sounds very good, but this is a snapshot of today, and that's not enough to decarbonize the whole world or Chinese steel industry, simply because it's projected there's not enough scrap available to make equivalent and savings of carbon in the industry. And only by 2030 there'd be potentially 1/3 of scrap availability to accommodate 1/3 of the steel industry. And we know this by life cycle analysis of steel containing goods in the past. So since there's not enough scrap available, there are two main choices in the long run to achieve carbon zero in steel. These are using hydrogen to replace the gas in the blast furnace or make direct reduced iron, or using carbon capture and storage. It's also possible in some situations to combine both. And I should say, incidentally, hydrogen has already been used, but so far its costs are not competitive at the moment. These options are being examined presently by the global steel industry, including inside of China. They have pros and cons in terms of commercialization, operating costs and capex. Subsidies and higher carbon prices will almost certainly be required to make them competitive. And this is why King's College and ANU project is really so interesting, since it's researching one of these long-term options that really are required to achieve carbon zero in the long run. So I think that's all I'll say for the moment. I'm very happy to answer questions with my fellow panelists here. And so I'll hand that back to you, Hannah, so we can move on to the question session.
Thank you so much for that, John. That was a fascinating insight into some of those broader sectoral shifts. It's certainly a very complex and technical area, but hopefully we can pull out some of those key elements of that in today's discussion. I'd like to welcome all of the researchers to the screen so we can begin our panel discussion. Welcome, John, Frank, and Musumi. I'd just like to kick off. We mentioned there in the video that China has a goal to reach peak emissions by 2030 and to reach carbon neutrality by 2060. Can you just go into a little bit more detail about the importance of the steel sector in terms of China's goal to meet that pathway in its decarbonisation plans? Musumi, can we start with you?
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. So as I said in the video, steel sector is very important when we look at the emissions. It has, in 2019, steel production was responsible for 3.7 gigaton of emissions. This is about 10% of global carbon emissions. And for the economy, of course, steel is very important, and it is no strange that it is known as the backbone and enabler of society's evolution and progress. It is used as a raw material in many industries, including car manufacturing, construction, consumer durables. Now, when we come to China and looking at what kind of China's demand for steel is, and what is the current value of, say, iron ore trade and coking coal between Australian economy, I would say it is a very important part of Australia's export portfolio. The demand for Chinese steel is largely within the economy, and this is used in automobiles, construction, and many other sectors. From the Australia-China trade perspective, the trade in 2019 of iron ore and coking coal together was valued around $60 billion. And most of this is from the iron ore exports. Now, this is about 25% of Australia's all exports by value. So it is one of the very important trade route.
Absolutely. Wow. Yeah, it's definitely a very important sector economically speaking. We heard obviously in the video about this potential for introducing hydrogen into the process, and John touched on some other, I guess, options such as using steel scrap, which wouldn't be enough to decarbonize at the rate that we need to. John Pye, would you be able to just talk a little bit about the sort of technical viability of achieving this and Australia's capability for doing that, and what kind of time horizon we might be talking about with this shift?
Yeah, sure, Hannah. I guess, yeah, the projections are obviously that currently hydrogen's an expensive fuel, and John Johnson mentioned that, and certainly that's true. Currently, we'll need cost reductions in hydrogen production to make green steel using hydrogen actually competitive in the market without support. Nevertheless, there are projections. McKinsey and Bloomberg have made such projections saying that we can expect anticipated technology improvements and scale effects expected to put the cost of hydrogen in the sort of mid-range of the cost of coal-based steelmaking by around 2030 or 2035, that sort of time frame. That's the projections that are coming from the hydrogen side of things. And although, of course, there's always debate about projections, if that happens, then the costs of hydrogen are going to be where they need to be. And that puts the pressure on the steel industry to figure out how to actually make that all work. It gives us 10, 15 years to get the equipment and get the investment and put everything alongside what will hopefully be a sufficiently cheap hydrogen production route. And when we talk about that in the context of Australia, it's really important for us to realise that we don't have premium iron ore in the quantities that would be required, and so it's critical that we understand how to deal with the impurities in our Pilbara ores in particular, which are 95% plus of what is shipped to China currently. And then we also need to find out if, what is the cheapest way of producing that hydrogen? Where is the cheapest way to produce that hydrogen? And could it be that in the Pilbara, with its amazing solar radiation and so on, that's maybe where this all happens? Yeah, I hope that answers all of the parts of your question.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, John. John Jay, did you want to add anything there from a sort of more industry perspective on the options and viability of doing this?
Yeah, of course, if there was a change in the carbon price with various emission trading schemes coming into play as well, that might incentivize a move away from the traditional blast furnace with coke and iron ore towards the hydrogen-based route. We've made estimates that if a carbon price went up, it's going to sound a big number, above $200 a ton. Then that would start to make alternative technologies more interesting and incentivize those technologies. Of course, there's the initial capex as well, which is a significant issue, and we need to overcome that, because you've got sunk costs in a lot of existing steel mills. Sorry to throw spanner in the works here. But there is another option, which is carbon capture and storage, which would be possibly competing at the same time. And I wouldn't necessarily exclude a combination of both hydrogen and carbon capture and storage if you're using hydrogen to produce DRI that went in the blast furnace, or adding hydrogen to the blast furnace as well. So you can't necessarily exclude various combinations of technologies at the same time. And then the big question is, where will that technology be? Will it be reside in Australia or somewhere else?
Adding to that, Frank, in the context of the Australian economy, and we've heard the recent announcement about Australia's 2050 net zero target, what are the barriers and drivers happening in the economy to try and push this forward?
Yeah, Hannah, and coming back to your very original question there, look, I mean, this is a long-term proposition, possibly a very long-term proposition in terms of a completely decarbonized global steel supply chain, right? John Johnson pointed out very correctly that, the kind of carbon penalties that we're looking at in terms of the competition of green steel with existing blast furnace are very high by today's measure, right? And so this needs to be seen in the context of a shift to net zero, right? So green steel at mass, at large scale, is not something you do early on in the process. It's something you do towards the back when you've exhausted the easier possibilities, right? And of course, those carbon premiums might not stay as high as they currently are, right? So the typical pattern with these types of new technologies is that they become dramatically cheaper as they're technologically refined and as they're deployed at scale. The question with this one really is, how do you establish an essentially new large-scale commodity processing industry, right? In an industry where there's actually a massive global supply capacity established, and where demand for that capacity is probably declining rather than increasing, right? And so this is one of the harder nuts for policy to crack ultimately. Now, your question about Australia, right? So if you just look at the geography and the fundamental underpinnings, then Australia in particular, Western Australia, is one of the places in the world that would be well placed in principle for such a green iron industry and potentially a green steel industry to emerge. That doesn't mean that it automatically will, right? Because there tends to be a certain persistence, geographical persistence in where these industries are, right? And so from an economic point of view, when we think about how to fulfill a net zero mandate globally most cost effectively, the question to ask is, how do we ensure that green iron and steel industry will actually emerge in the places in the world where it can produce most cost effectively long term? And that's not an altogether straightforward question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Frank. I guess, thinking about that from China's perspective, what are the motivators for wanting to do this? Is it just decarbonisation and reaching that pledge, or are there other factors at play? John J, did you want to jump in here?
Okay. Yeah, thanks. I think certainly there are other factors at play. And, like most of these industry changes, it works best if there's more than one primary motivator. And China, is moving up the value chain and no longer wants to focus on high energy consuming industries, notably those products that are exported. It's prepared. We know it's prepared now to tolerate imports of steel. It's gone from a large net exporter of steel to becoming close to balanced. It prefers to add value to the steel and export cars and machinery, for example. And the same is happening in other industries. Aluminium, which is a big energy intensive industry, has now gone into a net import situation. And, during the last 5-year plan, we saw China close up to 300 million tons of steel production, and now they're tolerating imports. They're putting taxes on exports of some low value steels. So they are adjusting now to change that balance. The issue is how far will they go to offshore, you know, that amount of steel that is required, you know, and they have declared that, you know, they regard manufacturing as extremely important. And I think that will remain so. Steel, you know, is a relatively sort of regional business to some extent. So I think that the issue there is how far they're prepared to offshore, you know, the steel industry. And then it becomes, if it's offshored, is that represent carbon leakage? And that's where it, you know, we have to decide whether that steel would be green or not. And the other one option obviously is to import green steel from the likes of Australia, whether that be at the margin or more substantial. So the big issue is how far China wants to go in terms of, you know, offshoring its steel industry. It's shown signs that it's prepared to do that. It's doing it in stainless steel, and may go further afield in carbon steel. So that's the big issue, I think, in this context.
Thanks, John. We've already spoken a bit about, you know, the importance of Australia's iron ore and coal exports to China. We talked in the video about how, despite the relationship has been not at its greatest place over the last couple of years, that iron ore has certainly remained a constant factor, and Australia's exports in that sector have continued to grow and added $190 billion to the economy last year. So it's obviously very key for Australia and something that makes headlines quite often. I think it's an area that's resistant to change because of the value that it brings. Just thinking about that in the context of green steel, how will that impact Australia's economy going forward? I'll throw it open to who would ever like to take that one.
I'm happy to have a first go at this one. So for Australia, including for taxation revenue, by the way, for Australia, this is a really big question, right? Because right now there's really massive iron ore exports to China and to a few other countries, but mostly to China. And there's very large coking coal, metallurgical coal exports as well to many countries, including China, right? And so, you know, a sort of a bad economic and trade future for Australia in a net zero carbon world has the iron ore exports continuing or potentially diminishing, right? And the coking coal exports gone, right? And a very positive net zero steel economic future for Australia has at least some of the value added on the Australian mined iron ore happening in Australia, for example, green iron production or even green steel production, right? And the two scenarios differ by an order of hundreds of billions of dollars per year in the future. So this is a first order long-term economic as well as fiscal issue for Australia. And once again, you know, we spoke earlier about where does this processing take place least cost, right? We also need to, of course, be cognizant of strategic considerations there, right? Because, you know, it's well known that countries that have manufacturing of one kind or another, be it steel or something else, are normally quite reluctant of letting it go to another place in the world, even if that other place in the world might be able to do a better job at doing it cheaply, right? So all of these things are, you know, still to be sorted out in one way or another.
Thanks, Frank. Mozumi, did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, Hannah, I mean, as Frank said, that it is the entire value chain, and then you could have just the iron ore being exported, or you could just have even the steel being produced in Australia. Where we would land in that long value chain, this is something that we need to work out, because it will depend on a lot of other considerations. What would be the cost of storing renewable energy, including the strategic ones. So I think there is a lot of techno-economic analysis to be done to be able to understand what part can we do in Australia, and what part is not possible?
Absolutely, it's certainly not straightforward. John P. or Jay, did you want to add anything?
Well, yeah, I mean, I appreciate that, you know, it's a long value chain, and Australia may progressively move along that depending upon, you know, the incentives that come about. I think the easiest way for Australia to add value is to add value to the iron ore. That includes, you know, more beneficiation, pellet production, and production of direct reduced iron, potentially using gas, perhaps. But that creates a little bit of a tension between the steel producers and the miners, in so much that actually is using more energy in Australia to produce the iron ore as such. Although that by adding value to that iron ore, it's saving the steel makers a lot of potential CO2 issues. So by adding to the CO2 at the mine, it's basically saving the iron and steel producers some CO2. And those guys are producing between 100 and 300 times more CO2 than the miners. So, you know, do you sacrifice the mine in the interests of the steel? And from a CO2 total global perspective, that's what I think needs to be done. So at the moment, we've got that what I call a tension between the miners and the steel makers, in so much the steel makers want the miners to generate more CO2 by adding more energy to the iron ore. That's how that plays out. It could be interesting, but that may be one way of adding value to Australian iron ore, as is being pursued already. But longer term, I appreciate there may be other opportunities to go even further up the value chain.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, John. You just touched there on the energy side of things. And I wanted to ask you, John Pye, about, you know, that quote in the video around needing to add 7 times more capacity to the national energy market. What positive indicators have we seen in Australia that are heading towards that in the renewable energy sector?
Yeah, there are some signs actually, Hannah. I mean, there are a couple of very large projects and very large initiatives being framed around renewable electricity, including in the Pilbara region and across into Northern Australia, Northern Territory. So, you know, sort of multi-gigawatt scale projects where photovoltaics is being deployed with a view to either undersea cables across to Singapore or production of ammonia. Those are considered to be some of the easier or more direct ways to capitalize on the amazing solar resource in that part of the world. And you've got companies like Fortescue and their Fortescue Future Industries offshoot investing really heavily in this and seeing potentially some of those synergies. And in fact, I think it's safe to say that's happening across the mining sector in Australia. Those companies looking to understand maybe the shorter term steps of increasing renewable use in their mining operations, but then there's definitely an eye on, you know, maybe going down that value chain, beneficiation, pelletization, eventually direct reduced iron. And yeah, the 7 times number does come from calculating that if we actually processed our 900 megatons per year of iron ore in Australia using a solar energy to electrolyze the hydrogen to direct reduced iron chain, yeah, the scale is enormous. And I think you know, I don't want to say that's going to happen, because the scale of that is pretty mind-boggling. But even if it happens at 10% of that, that's still a huge infrastructural investment. And it's, I think, one of the biggest things Australia can actually do for its emissions. You know, if we did this at a large scale, we'd actually be going very significantly negative as a country in emissions, and potentially also supplying reduced iron at a price that's competitive, maybe cheaper than it can be produced in other parts of the world. So this is, you know, this isn't going to happen overnight, but I think this is a very serious long-term prospect for Australia to grapple with and understand.
That's really encouraging to hear that there are some of those positive signals moving towards that way. But it sounds like a lot of challenges to achieve that, and maybe the time scale that we want to. I would just open it up to the audience Q&A because we've had a few questions come through. We've got one about Australia's commitment to net zero that was announced just recently. The questioner has asked that this commitment included a recommitment to the coal export industry into the long term. What incentives or disincentives may commit Australia to a more ambitious transition plan? Frank, that might be one for you, looking at those factors in the Australian economy to disincentivize or incentivize that shift.
Yeah, look, I mean, we're still busy here trying to figure out what the government's policy is. The so-called net zero plan was released just, less than half a day ago in Australia, and I think it's fair to summarize it as there is a commitment to net zero by the middle of the century. And there is an assertion by government that absolutely nothing will need to change. And so I'm saying that without any irony. I'm just describing the in short form, the contents of the document. And so, those things are obviously irreconcilable. And so there's still a long road to go from the headline political commitment that we now have to some sort of meaningful implementation pathway and set of policy settings. It's at one level, it's understandable because the politics of climate change in Australia over the last 10 to 12 years have really been extremely difficult. And it is a great positive that there is this headline commitment now by that side of politics, which for over a decade has been implacably opposed to climate change policy. And so, in a sense, consider this the very first step in some sort of long journey. The future of the coal industry, the gas industry, is really at the very heart of the political contest over this. And it'll be a long time, is my prediction, until we see a federal government in Australia saying openly that the days of the coal industry are numbered, because it is just such a political hot potato.
If I could add something to that one, I agree with everything Frank said. I think when it comes to what Australia can sell to its public, they can sell reducing emissions locally. But when you export coal, the emissions happen when it's burnt, right? They happen somewhere else. And I think what we're going to see is that China, Japan, Europe, USA, Korea, all of our trading partners who buy our coal, they're going to be the ones that turn off the demand for coal. And so, I don't think it's actually that critical that Australia's sort of sitting on the fence a bit with coal. I still think we can see big changes come through.
Okay, yeah, because it's more about, the demand side that might sort of cause that disruption. Muzumi, I saw you nodding along there. Did you want to add anything on that question?
This is so Australia is the supplier of coal. So a lot of it will depend on who demands coal. And in a net zero world, where will this demand come for? Which kind of coal will be demanded? Whether will it be coking coal, which is used in steel production, or will it be thermal coal? So, and when all this is changing, then there will be changes within the domestic economy as well. And we have seen that Australia has the potential to make that change. So we have the co-location benefit of where our good quality iron ore mines are available, along with the renewables. So I think this is a very big positive.
Well, that's good to hear. John Jay, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, just add that, the other technology, which is carbon capture, would support the continued use of metallurgical coal as well. So let's not forget carbon capture, which is not necessarily encouraged by some, but that is still a viable option that would help support the continued use of metallurgical coal in steel production as well. And as I said before, it can be combined with hydrogen as well under some circumstances.
Thanks, John.
I can mention in passing, if it's okay, there are a couple of other interesting things also on this. I mean, we're far from seeing successful deployment of carbon capture and storage at scale, and we're also far from seeing successful deployment of hydrogen ion making at scale. So, definitely impossible to say exactly where that's all going to go, but there are even other technologies lurking in the background. There are direct electrolytic pathways to making iron. There's a company called Boston Metals that's trying to skip the hydrogen entirely, and there are other processes like electrowinning. So I think there's a whole charge, a stampede of possible technologies coming forward. And yeah, it's I think over the 10 to 20 year time frame that we'll actually see a winner in that space, and I think there will be one.
Just following on from that, John and John, we've got a question directed to you from Dominic Ma, who's a PhD student at ANU, who has asked, which firms do you think would do the decarbonised iron reduction? Would current steel makers who understand iron ore reduction processes but aren't located in WA do it? Or would iron ore miners expand vertically into a process they have no experience with? Or would international firms enter the Australian market to do this low carbon iron or carbon-free iron export? Do you have a view on that in terms of, which kind of players in the industry would intervene to kind of make this happen?
I mean, all I'd say, it's happening now to some extent already with miners producing, direct reduced iron where they have access to low cost gas or even coal-based gas in some markets. So the move into DRI as it is now produced is not a huge deal for an iron ore producer, perhaps, who has access to low-cost energy. Going beyond that, though, may be something that is, warrants some steel-making expertise, and that's where probably the dividing line occurs, and potentially going beyond that would be the role of the steel maker, I would suggest, and that may reside at the steel producers. And we've seen lots of cooperation in terms of between steel makers and iron ore producers, incidentally, which is worth stating, even between China and Australia. All the major producers of steel in China are cooperating with all major mining companies in Australia, remember, which is a great thing specifically in decarbonisation technologies. So we're seeing some of it's early days, but it's already happening to some extent as well.
Thanks, John. Do you want to add that anything, John Pye?
Yeah, a little thing. I guess the China perspective is at a scale that's completely different to Australia. When we talk about steelmaking, it's really actually important to understand that the scale of our iron ore exports, 900 megatons per year, compares to our steel production, 5 megatons per year. So it would take an amazing transformation for our local steel producers to undertake this at the scale that we're talking about. So, I mean, it's going to be difficult for Australia to find the money and find the investment here. Also, our steel producers have really been under the pump, and for a lot of years it hasn't been amazingly profitable. There was a whole Senate inquiry a few years ago about saving the steel industry and so on. So, it's going to be important for probably where the money comes from, is where the money's being made at those miners. And I think if it's going to happen with Australian resources, it would be pushed by the miners more than the steel producers.
Thanks, John. We've got a question from Gustavo on the political situation between Australia and China, and I guess the prospects, or whether there are any initiatives or could be, between the Australian and Chinese governments to make steel more sustainable and to cooperate in this area. Frank, do you have a view on that? And I guess, yeah, what the likelihood is on the two coming to the table together to work on an area like this?
Look, that kind of bilateral collaboration would, of course, be very, very desirable, right? And I think in future there might be every opportunity to do that. And you know, oftentimes the research sphere as well as the business sphere is a useful anchor for these kinds of conversations when the political relationships are difficult, as certainly they are at the moment. And so, you know, Australia has some new low carbon energy partnerships internationally with a range of countries. It's not presently conceivable, I think we can say, that such an agreement would be struck with China in the context of the very well known bilateral tensions that exist. But you know, it makes very great sense for the two countries to enter a dialogue about the future of those industries, about opportunities for cleaner production processes, about implications for product supply chains and so forth. And you know, for steel, that's an obvious important one. But that's the case for other trade and investment areas, especially in resources as well.
And I mean, without having that sort of high-level ministerial dialogue happening, which, you know, I understand hasn't been happening for a while, what's the role of other players, you know, speaking from university perspective, working with partners in China or working with government partners, whether it's in Australia and China? Is that all still happening despite, you know, that more high-level tension?
Look, the established channels between researchers and research institutions are certainly open. And it's oftentimes the case that universities can take the role of honest brokers and also of, in a sense, neutral venues that can serve a discussion that may be more open than it could ever be had, you know, in good times or bad, between government officials. And so, yeah, that's a very vital role that universities play, or that the leading universities in any case play the world over. And certainly that's something we're looking to contribute on as well. Absolutely.
We've got time for a final question, and I want to hear everybody's view on this. So we'll go around the screen. I want to know what are people's hopes for objectives out of COP26, which is happening over the next couple of weeks. John Jay, can I start with you?
Yeah, I'll be very quick because I know we're running short of time. The two things really. One, sort of professionally, I'd like a more detailed roadmap from China as to how they intend to get to zero carbon by 2060. It's all very well announcing a strategy for what you have by 2060, but you really need more detail. I suspect behind closed doors they have those, but it'd be nice to know a little bit more about that. And I think there's an obligation to provide every 5 years what's called a nationally determined contribution at COP26. So let's be looking forward to that. But I think personally, I'd like to see more global initiatives to support those developing economies that are unable to afford decarbonisation. And so I think there's a lot more required there, because that may again be some of the sort of lowest hanging fruit to decarbonise in some of those economies that can't afford to do it at the moment. So that would be interesting to watch.
Thanks, John. John P., did you want to share your thoughts on COP26?
Yeah, sure. just picking up on John Johnson's comment there, the developing countries are terribly important when it comes to our outlook for emissions over this, time frame 2030 through to 2050 and beyond. If we see anything like the development in, for example, Africa that has happened in China over recent years, then the demand for steel and all of those things, it'll be the same story again. I don't know if that'll happen or how quickly, but it's developing these technologies in this particular sector could end up being an important part. As for my outlook on COP26 or hopes, I hope that Australia will see a bit of pressure to firm up some commitments shorter term, 2030. I think those would help a lot with investor certainty and driving some of these things that we hope will happen. And I hope there'll be discussions about the kinds of mechanisms that will help this, for example, this iron and steel transition to happen. There's all of these carbon border adjustment mechanisms in Europe, and we haven't talked about them particularly tonight, but they could be incredibly important in pushing this whole industry into a new space. And I think so. Some of those things are hopefully discussions that are going to advance in that meeting.
Thanks, John. Muzami, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I would be looking out for just one thing, is the timeline. I think what countries mean between now and 2050, what happens in 2030, what countries have 2025. I think this is in line with what most of the youth would want to know, because we all want to live longer, right? So I would be really looking for what the countries, each country puts on the table in terms of timeline, and their matching between their commitments and their actions. And then I think 3 sectors to look out for would be what happens to coal, what happens to gas and oil. So I think that's it.
Thank you, Muzami. And final words from Frank.
Look, the big thing in Glasgow will be announcements by countries about stronger ambition, net zero, but particularly for 2030, right? And really what that does is to kick off the UN process of the global stocktake of progress towards the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And that process should really spur countries on to get on with policy implementation, but also to get on with their own national strategies and plans about how to go about decarbonisation, including the long time horizon to 2050 to 2060 in terms of net zero. And that's what I would put just about top of the list, right? Leaders coming home from Glasgow or ministers coming home from Glasgow and saying, look, we really need a proper national strategy on how we're going to go about this.
Thanks, Frank. Well, that concludes the session today. Thank you so much, all of our speakers, Frank, Muzami, John and John. And thank you so much on all your work preceding this there at ANU and this research. And it was really fantastic to partner with ANU on this project to shine a light on a topic that is, very complex and technical, but it is one that we want to engage in the public dialogue and hopefully motivate different actors and start to see a shift because it's in all of our interests to decarbonize a sector that is such a high emitter and hopefully make that both environmentally and economically sustainable. Thank you very much to all of those participants who have joined us. The project that we launched at the beginning of this session will be available online if you'd like to rewatch or share that. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is being part of our China Week. So please do have a look at some other sessions that we have coming up, both online and in person, including a book launch later today. We've got a session on the Green Belt and Road tomorrow, and one on digital activism in China, as well as one looking at the health impacts of climate change in China. So lots of diverse subjects there to look at, but thank you for your interest today, and we hope to see you again very soon. Thanks, everyone.
And we thank King's College and also the Lau Institute. Great stuff. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.